I've literally spent the last 15 minutes debating whether to film this video immediately or not, whether to wait until tomorrow, Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon perhaps, to go ahead and film this. But even though it's 10:15 on Friday night and I feel absolutely wilted, like I could fall asleep any moment, I've decided to film this book discussion about Adieux, A Farewell to Sartre by Simone de Beauvoir, because my house is completely empty. My roommate has been out for several hours and I don't believe she'll be back until after 11, and the gals downstairs are away for the week because it's reading week for the university students. And so I'm literally completely alone, and so I don't have to feel the tiniest bit self-conscious that anyone is listening to me ramble to myself. It's funny because they have no idea that I film for YouTube, and so I assume that they assume, if they hear me, that I'm either Skyping or talking and swearing at myself. Sometimes when I abruptly swear, I'm not filming, but that's just me. So, on to the book. I've been working on this for the past week and a half, 2 weeks. I mentioned it in the Friday Reads video that I filmed a couple hours ago. And in my Friday Reads, I forgot to mention what the bulk of this book is. The first quarter to a third of it is that essay that Simone de Beauvoir wrote about saying goodbye to Sartre. The rest of it is a transcript, an edited transcript, but a transcript of conversations that Simone had with Sartre in 1974 while they were on vacation, shortly before his death. And these conversations are really what I want to talk about. But I'm going to talk a bit about this little essay, well, it's not little, but the personal essay about Sartre's death first. As I said in my Friday Reads, she does something that not a lot, or at least in my experience, no other authors that I've read have attempted. She approaches death from a very personal and up close and detailed view to the very end, to the very last moments. And it's interesting because reading this, as a reader, we can compare her response to Sartre's death to that of her mother. When her mother died, there was part of her that didn't want to be there. For Sartre's death, she really wants to be there. She describes how after he died, the next morning after she and a few other friends had spent the night with his body in the hospital room, she curled up on the bed beside him on the outer sheet because he had bed sores, and the nurse warned her not to climb under the sheet as she was about to. She curled up next to his body and she slept for several hours. Which is kind of an odd thing to think about, lying next to a dead loved one's body, someone who's been dead for several hours, for I think half a day at this point. And she describes a little bit the process of grief, the process of coming to terms with the fact that the person who she spent the better part of her life with, who she's loved for pretty much the entirety of her adult life, coming to terms with the fact that he is indeed dying and he's going to be gone soon, and she is not going to be reunited with him ever. Even death won't reunite them. What Simone does is she gets up close and personal with this process of decline. It's just not his death. It's not just how she felt leading up to his death. It's the onset of blindness, the strokes, the stumbling, him turning more and more to alcohol, her reaction to this, and she recounts his realization that he is headed towards death, part denial, part acceptance, realizing that he's never going to get his sight back, he's never going to be able to read again, to do the things that he loved again. There's a really nice quote here on page 99. She quotes him saying, "I am not dead, in fact. I eat and I drink. But I am dead in that my literary work is finished. My relations with everything I've written hitherto are no longer the same. I work with you. You have ideas that are not mine, and that will make me go in certain directions that I used not to take, so that I produce something new. I produce it as a last work, and at the same time as a work set apart, not belonging to the whole, though naturally possessing some characteristics in common with it, the comprehension of freedom, for example." Part of the process of decline is essentially the death and the decline and the death of his intellectual life, what has been his life work. He's physically still alive, and mentally he's still quite sharp, but because he's in ill health, because he can't read or really write for himself anymore, because he's relying on his friends, on Simone, to read to him, to translate the world for him, to translate him to the world, since he can no longer express himself in writing the way he used to. He's not living the same sort of life. He's not the same person anymore. That is over, and he can quite clearly see that whether it's 5 years from now or 5 days from now, he is going to die, and it's all going to be over, and there's nothing that he can do about it. It was a very, very moving piece. Perhaps even more moving than a very easy death. But so we have that, and then the bulk of this book is the conversations that she has transcribed and edited. The preface to the conversations, she says they took place in Rome during the summer of '74, and then in Paris at the beginning of fall. Sometimes Sartre, when he was tired, gave indifferent answers, or it was I who lacked inspiration and asked pointless questions. I have omitted the conversations that seemed to me without interest. The others I have arranged according to their theme, at the same time keeping more or less their chronological order. It's her editing, her arrangement according to theme, the fact that she asked these questions, which make them not 100% a reflection of Sartre's life and his work, but very much a reflection of Simone de Beauvoir's own life and her own works. I wrote a big note here when I was about 3/4 of the way through the book, because it suddenly dawned on me. This volume, this final volume, that can be considered the final volume of her memoirs, is in essence a summary of the themes of her memoirs, the themes of her novels, and her own perception of her life and relationship with Sartre. This is her putting her stamp on what they were. This is her recording for the history book, so to speak, for the public, her version of the relationship that she had with Sartre. So I wrote here, although this is a dialogue and seems at first glance to be Sartre's story, Simone is the one controlling the narrative, and there's the themes and the narratives presented here are the ones from her memoirs and novels. In essence, this is the final volume of her memoirs. This is the completion of her attempt to define for history the nature of her relationship with Sartre. Her strength as a writer, as an intellectual, really shows in this volume. And these conversations, they really are kind of a goldmine. Simone leads Sartre into conversations about everything from his relationship with women. He has a very, very odd response to that. Turns out he didn't really get along with men. He hated when they confided in him. But when women confided in him, he was perfectly fine with it. In fact, he preferred the friendship of women, and Simone asks him if he had a Pygmalion complex. And he sort of agrees to that and says that yes, he liked taking women kind of under his wing and teaching them things and engaging in sexual relationships with them as well. So yeah, his sex life is described, his relationship with reading. He must have been really annoyed when they were discussing his relationship with reading and literature, because he says that literature isn't a part of his life anymore, and he refuses to define really what literature has meant to him in the past and what it means to him now. He skirts around the subject as if he either doesn't know or just doesn't want to talk about it. And it's really odd that someone who wrote so many novels should say that literature lost value for him. He turned to reading a lot of pulp fiction, of popular fiction, saying that the serious literary works just didn't do it for him anymore. On the other hand, in talking about their early relationship together, the literature that they read together, Simone says that, in short, reading was a way of seizing the cultural world and at the same time a pleasure, of course. And Sartre says, that's it, a pleasure, but I was also making the world my own. So she has some very succinct things to say about literature. Sartre, not so much. I've been rambling so much that I just used up the space on my camera. So uploaded that, jumping back to this. When I'm tired, things may end up a little fragmented, but I wanted to film this now because I was motivated and I didn't want to lose my initial thoughts. So the picture of Sartre that I got from reading these conversations is not a flattering one. We get a man who seems to have abused drugs, taking certain pills to help him write, which apparently sent him into kind of a fidgety, somewhat frantic state, taking sleeping pills to go to bed at night, and Simone suggests to him in these dialogues that perhaps he wouldn't need the sleeping pills if he hadn't been taking these other drugs when he started writing, and perhaps he only needs the sleeping pills now because he's been taking them for so long because he believes he can't sleep without them. In addition to that, alcohol abuse. She describes in the essay how the doctors told him not to drink because it was bad for his health. It might contribute to another stroke, to further health issues. And he convinced a number of the women in his life, young women, to bring him alcohol, and he hid the bottles, and the moment he was left alone, he binged on it. He drank it all, and I believe it was Arlette, another key woman in his life, found him passed out on the floor, and yet he claims he didn't have a drinking problem. But in this book and in at least one or two of Simone's other memoirs, she mentions his serious drinking, how much he would drink when they were alone together. And Simone doesn't seem to have been a big drinker, but she recounts how in the evenings he would pour himself a glass and then another, and he would often go to bed drunk. And I believe she says more than once she was concerned, a little frightened for him. And then he has some interesting things to say about food. They talk about food. He doesn't eat a lot of vegetables, doesn't like tomatoes or shellfish or crustaceans. Crustaceans remind him too much of insects. Shellfish remind him of minerals that have to be dug out from the earth. Doesn't like fruit. He says fruit because if I want to eat something sweet, I'd rather have something man-made, a cake or a tart. In that case, the appearance, the putting together, and even the taste have been thought out by man and made on purpose, whereas the taste of fruit is a matter of chance. Apparently fruit is too natural. He says, food must be the result of work performed by men. Bread is like that. I've always thought that bread was a relation with other men. So we get a man who doesn't eat a lot of seafood, doesn't eat a lot of fruit or vegetables, and furthermore it says he doesn't eat a lot of meat either, which means he's eating a lot of bread, probably cheese, cakes, pastries, processed foods, consuming a lot of alcohol, consuming drugs, and then he has poor health. As well, we get a picture of what I'm going to refer to as class privilege. It's no secret that they were bourgeois, and they have an interesting conversation about money. Sartre claims that he has never specifically made the connection between the work he does and the money he earns. As a child, he describes the money he was given from his mother, from his stepfather, as something that would be exchanged in return for the candy, the sweet that he is being given. So he's not being given the money, he's being given the thing, the good. Even when he started working as a teacher, he didn't correlate his work to the money he was earning. He didn't put a lot of value in money. As soon as he got money, he would spend it, he would borrow, he would repay, he would lend. So he comes from a very privileged position where he didn't spend a lot of time in childhood or as a young man or even later in life thinking about money, thinking about needing money, having money. Or at least he claims not to. And he seems to think this is a good thing, that it makes him free, and I suppose it does make you free. But I fail to understand how you can connect with the average person when money has never really been a concern for you. He claims that he was never anxious, never concerned about getting by, about establishing himself in a career. It's as if he felt his career as a teacher and later as a writer were established already, as if they were presupposed. He never worried, what if I can't get that job? What if I can't support myself? What will happen to me? Which I think is something that anyone who doesn't come from money obviously thinks about, has to think about, should think about, and yet he claims not to have had to think about that. So kind of in conclusion, this was an interesting work. There's a lot to think about here, a lot to discover, a lot of connections to make to other works, both by Sartre and by Simone de Beauvoir. But I think if you're not familiar with at least some of the key works by Sartre, so The Words, The Age of Reason, Nausea, a little bit about being in nothingness, if you're not familiar with Simone de Beauvoir's memoirs, you might not get as much out of A Farewell to Sartre as I did. You might not exactly understand what they're talking about, what they're referencing, what these conversations are in relation to. The essay at the beginning can perfectly well stand alone. although it is kind of a continuation of Simone's earlier biographical works, autobiographical works. But the dialogues, I think, are something best saved until after you've dived into at least the most popular works by these two authors and philosophers. And if you're not interested or compelled by those other works, then this is probably not the work for you. Now, I am extremely tired. I've got that, you know when you're really tired and you feel a little bit spaced out, like your mind is floating a moment back from reality. That's where I'm at right now. I have a feeling I'm like squinting because it happens when I get tired. So I'm going to shut this down, put it to upload, and climb into my cozy bed and sleep.